About counterplans. Counterplans are a very useful tool in your negative arsenal when debating a new affirmative, an old affirmative. Having a counterplan in your strategy is extremely useful because it forces the affirmative to defend a lot of the things that they're not usually ready to defend. And so we'll talk about this lecture will talk about the basics of a counterplan, how it's structured, different types of a counterplan, and then sort of the theoretical background and justifications for a counterplan, and then affirmative answers. So a counterplan is typically defined as an alternative policy option that is forwarded by the negative team to solve a majority of the app's advantages while avoiding some of the affirmative's disadvantages. So if you're trying to flow a counterplan, some common shorthand you'll see in this lecture, and a good way to write it down on your flow is to just write CP, given it with a like adjective before that, defining what type of counterplan it is. This is the best way to just write it down in your flow. But so for some of you who don't necessarily have debate experience or just haven't dealt with the argument that is like a counterplan, the easiest example to understand is, let's say you have this friend that really wants to go to McDonald's, right? And the reason why he or she wants to go to McDonald's is because they're hungry, and McDonald's will fulfill their hunger. Well, what the usefulness of a counterplan is, you can kind of see that there are other ways to fulfill your hunger, and there's not a reason why McDonald's is unique to solving that advantage, right? So if you're arguing for the policy to go to McDonald's with the advantage of it resolves your hunger, why is McDonald's unique to resolving your hunger, right? And it's not. And you can read a counterplan to sort of show that the connection between McDonald's and fulfilling your hunger is not one that's unique. And so what would be a common counterplan for that? Yeah, let's start. Go to Chick-fil-A. Okay. Literally any restaurant could fulfill your hunger. And so what the advantage that it solves is, hunger. What would be some disadvantages that going to Chick-fil-A over McDonald's avoids? Yeah. Healthier? Yeah. What? Okay, healthier? Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, they're both fast food, so they're not like super healthy, but yeah, you could say it tastes better, better chicken. McDonald's also has chicken sandwiches. You could say like Chick-fil-A has better service.
McDonald's kills you, and they dental. I used to work there, so I'm gonna do it all.
Okay.
So bad.
They treat their workers poorly. So see, this is sort of, when you're thinking of some sort of counterplan, you want to have a disadvantage to the original policy option or the affirmative that is avoided by the counterplan. So this disadvantage that the counterplan avoids, who knows what this is called?
Net benefit.
Yep, net benefit.
Oh.
So it is net beneficial to go to Chick-fil-A over McDonald's, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so sort of this logic will be something that you'll see throughout many different types of counterplans and net benefits that we'll talk about. Why do you think it's useful to have a counterplan in your negative strategy?
Yeah. Because if you have a counterplan in your negative strategy, then your counterplan can actually help you win the debate.
Okay, and why can it help you win the debate?
Because, like, let's say if the affirmative says something, you should go to McDonald's. Well, if there's a counterplan saying, oh, I think you should choose Chick-fil-A over McDonald's because McDonald's does not treat their employees right or whatever, and you go there and you say, okay, you want to expand on that and say, oh, and now if the coworkers are mad, then your food can be tampered with or something.
Okay.
So you should go like that. That'll help you win.
Yeah.
Because it solves the entirety of the app, but if you don't have a complement, it doesn't necessarily do anything.
Okay, yes,
That's the competitiveness of the affirmative plan.
Yeah, sure. It tests it tests the link between the plan and the counter plan is used to test the link between the plan and the advantages that are read, right? So if someone read some sort of policy option like going to McDonald's as their affirmative, there can be tons of reasons why going to McDonald's is good. To solve hunger, to get a toy, to get a kid's meal, to play in the playground. What? Exactly. Sure. So there can be a ton of unpredictable advantages to any type of affirmative, and if you have and you might not have specific answers to that advantage or specific answers to that specific link, and you'll most likely lose if you're stuck defending the status quo because if you have to defend that someone's hungry and can't get food, then you might lose your debate. But if you have an alternative way for that person to get food, then it can overcome a lot of the problems that exist in the status quo. Does that make sense? So there's a ton of reasons why the status quo is hard, and the affirmative gets to pick and choose those, and you might not have a specific answer, so having a counterplan can help a lot with, overcoming that issue. So the counterplan has a pretty set structure, and this is will follow a lot of what we're going to talk about. So the first thing that you'll see in a 1NC shell for a counterplan is the counterplan text. This, just like you have a plan text, you also have to have a counterplan text. And this follows the same format. So the United States federal government should do something. The People's Republic of China should do something. The 50 state governments should do something, right? Just like you have a plan that's the United States federal government should authorize drilling in Cuba with partnerships with the United States or whatever the plan text, you also have a counterplan text. And that will usually be the focal point of your 1NC and helps describe exactly what the counterplan does. The second thing that you'll see is counterplan competition, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this PowerPoint. The third thing is counterplan solvency. Just like the 1AC has solvency evidence, you also need to have solvency evidence for your counterplan, right? So sticking to the McDonald's Chick-fil-A example, you have to have evidence that Chick-fil-A does have food that would be able to resolve hunger. Just like the team reading the hunger advantage would need to have evidence that McDonald's has food that would be able to resolve your hunger, right? And so having solvency evidence is crucial because it helps, negate a large portion of the affirmative. And then the next part will be having some proof that there is a net benefit to the counterplan, whether or not that is an argument about why the counterplan avoids some disadvantage, or whether or not there's a unique advantage to the counterplan that the affirmative by itself cannot solve. But this will make a lot more sense as we go through this PowerPoint. So first we're going to talk about a bunch of different types of counterplanes. So one thing that you'll notice about the resolution and the way that it's written, and also the plan text, it says that the United States federal government should do something, right? And you're sort of forced to defend that the United States needs to act. So one counterplan that's in our evidence packet and that you'll debate a lot on this year's topic is the international actor counterplan. And so this, I think, should make the name gives it away, right? The actor of the plan doesn't have to be the United States federal government, but rather could be another country, like the People's Republic of China, right? And so this is especially popular on foreign assistance topics like this year's, because a lot of affirmatives on this year's topic will read advantages about why economic engagement to a particular country is a good idea, right? So if you think about the advantage that's in the Cuba Act, there's an advantage that says we need to give we need to drill oil with Cuba because they need quick access to supply. But there's no really good reason why the U.S. has to be the one giving that assistance. There are reasons, like China could give the assistance. Literally any other country could arguably give that assistance. So this is advantageous for the negative because it now forces the affirmative to have a defense of why the U.S. federal government has to give economic engagement. So does that make sense to everyone? So they need to have a U.S. key argument. So for those of you who have looked over the Cuba affirmative, what U.S. key arguments exist in that 1AC? Technology, okay.
Well, like the environment is all about for this ecosystem, so why does China care about for this?
Okay, that's a good one. So there's a couple. There's so parts of the 1AC, I don't know exactly where, have some arguments about U.S. expertise and ability and like control over technology. So like their drilling technology is safer. There's also a good argument for the Florida advantage. China, I think that your solvency arguments, you want to phrase it in a way that's more jurisdictional. So the U.S. has jurisdiction over the Gulf of Mexico. So China can't do cooperative drilling efforts in the Gulf of Mexico with Cuba because U.S. jurisdiction, without doing the plan, there's no jurisdiction for China to drill there, right? So, whereas, but there's that other advantage that's just like Cuba needs oil for, to prevent a Venezuelan cutoff, but China could just help Cuba with that oil, right? So it deals better with that third advantage. And then you'll have a lot of other affirmatives that will not have U.S. specific advantages, so having international actor counterplan is extremely helpful. So the net benefits, or the reasons why maybe a different actor over the United States is preferable, are any reason why U.S. action is bad, or like a sphere of influence disad. Have you guys looked over the China disad? The China disad is basically just like China thinks that Latin America is important for their national security and global influence, and that if the U.S. starts to engage countries in that region, then China will sort of be mad at the United States for crowding its sphere of influence. Does that make sense? And so that's a little bit complicated, but that's something that might be avoided by the China counterplan, but links to U.S. action, right? And so, or there's also the net benefit of just Chinese action alone is good, like Chinese soft power, Chinese politics, but that's a little bit next level, but a lot of that's in the counterplan evidence packet. So are there any questions about international actor counterplans or their usefulness? Okay, so the next set of counterplans is one very similar to international actor counterplans, and it's just a domestic actor counterplan. So as you see, the resolution says United States federal government, the plan says the United States federal government, and one potential counterplan is to say that the whole federal government doesn't have to do the plan, right? The whole normal means process of Congress doing legislation, the executive signing it, the courts deciding whether or not to strike it down, individual agency implementation as a whole process is one. Negatives will say that's one that the app has to defend. And so negatives can read a counterplan that says, instead of having the whole federal government do the plan, one particular agency could do this. So there's like the court's counterplan, which would, in the instance of the Cuba affirmative, would require just the Supreme Court striking down parts of the Cuba embargo, or the Congress could do it by itself, or an individual agency could just do the plan, like the Chamber of Commerce or any sort of agency that does a lot of trading. Yeah, executive order as well is also a particular, like a subsection of the federal government, and not the whole federal government. Okay, and this forces the affirmative to have a reason why the whole USFG the whole United States federal government acting together is important for solving the advantages. Now, who can think of like a good solvency deficit against these types of counterplays?
Um, that basically that we should kind of get China in so that they won't be mad at us and that stay right behind.
Yeah.
We already have some kind of rating that with China.
I don't know. The whole USFG hasn't really. That doesn't really have an effect about whether or not China gets enrolled. Yeah.
The whole USFG has, like, instead of just one actor, the whole USFG has more weighting power, like politics, and has more money there.
So, U.S. influence and credibility.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other thing is Obama for really long.
Okay.
That we can do.
So, I mean, well, think about one of the advantages is signaling U.S. commitment to Cuba in Latin America as a way to sort of generate influence in Latin America. But if only one agency is doing a policy to signal influence, then Cuba might not think that, you know, the whole USFG is trying to help out Cuba, right? And that's sort of a signal-based or clarity-based solvency deficit, right? You need to send a clear signal that the whole federal government cares about Cuba. Does that make sense? Okay. And the main net benefit that you'll see to these types of counterplans is the politics disad, because usually the negative will say that the affirmative has to defend some policy created by President Obama, and that the counterplan avoids political backlash because it narrows the implementation of the plan to one domestic actor, and Obama is able to shield the blame. So does that make sense a little bit without going into too much of the politics disad? Okay. The next type of counterplans are the most sort of make the most intuitive sense to me, but very rarely are implemented on a debate level, which is sort of surprising. But it's called an advantage counterplan. And so, given this name, who thinks they know what an advantage counterplan is? That's what.
It's all for like other like using the gas as.
Okay. So, sort of, the previous two examples that we talked about did the whole mechanism of the plan, did the exact same thing as the plan, just with a different actor that wasn't the United States federal government. The difference here with an advantage counterplan is that the thing that's getting done, most likely by the USFG, is not the plan, but rather something else, right? Some other policy towards Cuba or Latin America or Venezuela, that any part of Latin or Mexico, that is able to solve for the exact same advantage. So, you know, if you think like, so you could do things like cooperate with Mexico on alternative energy to solve U.S.-Mexico relations, or give democracy assistance to random parts of Latin America to solve like influence-based advantages. So as it relates to the Cuba affirmative, what are some, do you think, advantage counterplans, right? So there's the Florida environment advantage. Do you think there are other ways to preserve Florida's environment that aren't just Cuba, like drilling in Cuba? Work on clean energy. You could set up a program that is basically made to protect Florida's environment, right? And so there are literally, like, I bet when you read the advantages for the first time, you thought, well, it's not really intuitive how oil drilling between U.S. and Cuba resolves a lot of these issues, right? Or why it's the only thing that resolves a lot of these issues. And thus, that allows you to read different counterplans that takes advantage of that sort of disconnect. And so there's another advantage that says, you know, the U.S. has to signal influence to basically kick China out of Latin America. What sort of advantage counterplans can you think of as it relates to that? To like basically signaling U.S. influence in Cuba. What's like an advantage counterplan to solve the second advantage of the Cuba affirmative, which is, well, yeah, it's basically relations, yeah. Yeah, the democracy is a good one, yeah. Yeah, sure. Any sort of symbol of goodwill towards Cuba would be able to solve the reasons why, solve the reasons why that advantage is good. Yeah.
But however, the end of their list, though, saying that, there's too much kind of going on. Basically, they want a lot of real citizens to vote in for specific reasons, and they want to talk that with credit cards. Like, wouldn't that be just too much to handle?
Are you saying why the examples?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's also a problem with the affirmatives as well, right? Given that they won't let people in, they might not also let the drilling companies in. So that's when you're thinking of answers to a specific counterplan, you have to think about how they operate in terms of the affirmative that you're reading. All right. And so, sort of what we're getting at is this forces the app to have a defense of why their mechanism or what they're doing is important for the advantage. Why is oil drilling in Cuba important to all three of those advantages? It might not be clear, and then it's especially not clear when there's another mechanism for creating the same sort of change that the affirmative talks about. And so the net benefit here will be, as ideally it's specific to the plan, right? So you want to have a disad that says that oil drilling with Cuba is bad, or because then you want to, so given that these types of counterplans force the app to have a defense of their mechanism or their plan, then you want to have a reason why their mechanism or their plan is a bad idea. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So, yeah, the next type of counterplans are just a type of counterplan that instead of engaging the country of the 1AC, you could just choose to engage the country, engage a different country, okay? So, let's say someone said that there's like an Obama credibility add-on, right? Obama just has to signal that he cares about Latin American countries, right? And so think about it this way. There are a ton of advantages to engaging Cuba. There are a ton of advantages to doing oil drilling in Cuba. There are a ton of advantages to engaging Latin America generally. There are a ton of advantages to different parts of the engagement aspect, but it would be impossible to be negative if you had to be prepared to answer every single advantage about why economic engagement is a good idea, right? Or like basically any advantage the affirmative could read, if you had to be prepared to answer those, it would be hard. But if you are able to read a counterplan that engages another country that's not Cuba, it allows you to cast a wider net and have a counterplan that solves a lot of the reasons why engagement by itself is a good idea, right? Because you have a counterplan that also does engagement. Does that make sense?
As long as you're engaged, you're still going to solve the
Exactly. So like, apparently there's an Obama credibility add-on, or for example, the like U.S.-Cuban relations advantage. That's not really a U.S.-Cuba relations advantage. It's like a Latin America influence advantage, and there happens to be a card that says Cuba is key, right? And that's exactly what this is forcing the app to defend, right? It sort of tries to show that you can sort of engage and influence Latin America without going through Cuba, and there are other ways to resolve a lot of the advantages to just economic engagement, not the specifics of the affirmative, right? And so, that makes a little bit of sense. That could be like a Mexico or Venezuela, but it can also be any other Latin American country that's not focused on the topic, right? So, yeah, and so that makes intuitive sense that the net benefits would be whatever country the 1AC chose, you have to have a disad to why that country is bad. Like engaging that country is bad, right? So if you have a country-specific disad, so Cuba disad, Venezuela disad, or Mexico disad, and you read a counterplan to engage a different country, you can see why engaging a different country would be net beneficial, right? Because it avoids the country-specific disad. Yep. All right, cool. And so it will be really, in terms of negative strategy, you might really only need one or two of these types of counter plans throughout the year, and most likely teams will have country-specific advantages, just like you'll need country-specific disadvantages. But it's always useful to have this in your arsenal.
Can you avoid?
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit later when it comes to theoretical justifications. But yes, you can. It's not like there's no rule that prevents it, but there's some theoretical objections to doing that because people think that it makes it too hard for the affirmative and a contradiction. Yeah, but we can talk about that a little bit later. All right, another big counterplan that you'll see on this year's topic is a non-engagement type counterplan. One thing that is big in the literature is whether or not we should engage countries or regimes, or whether or not we should try to contain them. And the main difference is that engagement is defined, and Hayes maybe talked about this a little bit in his lecture, engagement is defined as sort of a positive inducement, a positive incentive that helps motivate some sort of change or economic aid towards a particular country. But containment is more one of like isolation or negative incentive. And there's actually a really big theoretical debate in the literature about whether or not regimes like Cuba or Venezuela need to be engaged, in whether or not we need to send a signal of goodwill, or whether or not they need to be contained through things like sanctions or political isolation. Yeah, engagement would fall more into the appeasement category. Containment would be the opposite. And so this forces the app to defend engagement as a theory is a good idea. And this is like there's a big debate on this, and I think I have an example of an author of that on the next slide. But you know, one sort of setback with this counterplan is that given that it centers around a huge theoretical debate of engagement versus containment, the more specific that the affirmatives become, the less applicable a theoretical counterplan like this can really be applied, because most of the Cuba 1AC and most of the 1ACs that you'll see, there won't be advantages to just, you know, engagement being good, or there won't be advantages to just generally just interacting with a country is good or bad. They'll be more specific and sort of have a built-in defense of the engagement that is less solved by containment. But, you know, if there are generic affirmatives, these will apply. Yeah.
So what is the context like?
That can be also specific. So that would probably mean like the USFG should institute like sanctions on Cuba, or any form of like military engagement or political isolation. Yeah, but it's usually like a United States federal government action, and they institute some sort of like negative incentive, right? This works better like it will like, so I think this might work good for the Venezuela affirmatives, because there will be a sort of advantages that's like we need to sort of appease the new Venezuelan government so they're pro-US, right? Well, in like a big focal point of the engagement literature is whether or not we should appease them or whether or not we should just force them into doing something that's eventually turns them into pro-U.S. government, right? So it fits better with like advantages that center around a government making a particular change. Yeah, so here's an example. There's like an article that is probably, I bet this is in the topicality file, but it says, it highlights a lot of the focal points of this debate. So while policymakers should give greater consideration to the idea of engagement, incentives will only be applicable only in a limited set of circumstances. In addition, unlike other foreign policy tools, engagement is open to charges of appeasement from its critics. Skeptics have also argued that engagement strategies can invite problems of moral hazard, where a cash-strapped regime watching America buy out North Korea's nuclear programs may be inspired to embark on its own endeavor in the hopes of later selling it to the United States. Moreover, as a strategy which often depends on reciprocal actions between the U.S. and the target country, engagement is likely to involve even higher risk and uncertainty than other foreign policy strategies. So this sort of highlights what the net benefits will be to the engagement versus containment counterplan, because it says that it sends a signal of appeasement, which other countries might take advantage of, and the second half of that says that people will just sort of pocket the engagement and not do anything to change their government, right? And so that's largely the necessity for a containment strategy. But that depends largely on the specific gaps. And then another type of counterplan that you'll probably see is just a non-economic engagement counterplan. So like that can be political engagement or military engagement. But most affirmatives will have a defense of their type of engagement that they do. So this won't have a ton of benefits, but it's something that you need to consider as part of your negative arsenal. Okay, a slightly more complicated version or complicated counterplan is a process counterplan. And so this usually, an important definition that you need to know for this is normal means. The negative will say that there is a normal way that the plan should be implemented, right? So it goes through Congress, the executive signs it, the courts do this. It has to be immediate, it has to be unconditional, because that's what your plan text says. You can't move away from what your plan text says. And they'll say that we should change the normal means process in which a plan gets implemented and should be done in another process, done in another way. So the common examples of this will be like, we should not do the plan until after an election, or not do the plan until after X bill passes, right? That's like a delay counterplan, which, if you have a plan text that says the USFG should, it might not necessarily mean do it immediately, right? But then you see how that's really strategic for the negative to just say, well, yeah, we should do the plan, that's all good, but we'll just do it later, right? Most likely, you don't have an advantage to doing the plan right now. Does that make sense? But so it's really strategic for the counterplan, but it's really strategic for the negative and really bad for the affirmative. But a general rule is that if it's really good for the negative and really bad for the affirmative, then there's most likely something suspect about it, right? Like it might be a little bit of cheating, right? Do you see how it might be unfair for the affirmative, for the negative, to just say, oh yeah, let's do that, but later, right? And so, there's a lot of theoretical objections to this counterplan, but people will still read it. And the same thing goes for these other types of counterplans, because they always will result in the plan, but the process in which it results in the plan is different than what the 1AC says. So can anyone think about why like if someone said, you know, we should do the plan, but we should run it by China first. Can anyone think of a reason why that might be legitimate theoretically? Yeah.
Because it helps so much more advanced if we're economically getting with somebody, we need to control our getting people that don't need to.
No, I'm saying why it might be theoretically illegitimate. Yeah.
Because what does China have to do with our debate topic?
Okay, yeah, so China might not have a ton of influence or a ton of relevance, yeah? Yeah, so you spend, you know, 8 minutes of the 1AC developing advantages, and the negative gets to read this small little counterplan that says, yeah, that's fine and good, and like, we think that should happen, definitely, but just run it by China first. Like, it's not super competitive because they're still agreeing with the plan, right? But it still does the plan. What the negative will say, though, is that it tests and it forces the affirmative to defend the certainty and immediacy of the 1AC. And nowhere is that really explicitly said in the 1AC, that the 1AC is certain or immediate, but it's a little bit implied. And the negative will say that it is competitive because there are still less instances. So like, what if China was like, no, we don't think you should do that? Then in that instance, the plan wouldn't actually be done. So it's not certain that the plan gets done in the world of the counterplan, but it is 100% certain in the world of the plan that it gets done. But that's like a little bit complicated, and sort of when we talk about competition, we'll get a little bit more to that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it was a question about what you just said.
Okay. No, go ahead.
Okay, so how would you leverage that like uncertainty of whether or not the plan is done?
Like, how would you leverage it as affirmative or negative?
Yeah, I know from you.
Okay, so it's useful on this topic because with like relations advantage, like so let's say you're Cuba, right? And you don't want your relationship, if you really do care about US-Cuban relations, you don't want your relationship with the United States and the assistance that they're giving you as Cuba to be influenced by a third party like China, right? Cuba wants to be certain that the assistance that they're giving the United States will be guaranteed and not taken away from them if China says no, right? So they feel like it's not a genuine relationship if it's not guaranteed by the U.S. and is dictated by like a country like China. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with like condition counterplans. Yeah. And the same thing goes with like clarity. If Cuba thinks that in some instance the plan might not necessarily get done, then they might not think that the U.S. is truly committed to the relationship and only cares about other issues. But we'll talk about the competition problems a little bit later. Okay. The last set of counterplans that we'll talk about are things that are called plan-inclusive counterplans, or also called PICs. And really what this does is it does most of the plan except one part of it, right? And so in a way, a lot of counterplans are PICs, right? In a way, they do it like international actor counterplans, domestic actor counterplans. Those are PICs because it does part of the plan. It does part of it just with a different actor, right? And in a way, the consult and condition counterplans and delay counterplans are also PICs because they do all of the plan, just changes the time when it happens, or changes who we consult, or changes, you know, whether it like picks out of uncertainty. So in a way, most counterplans are PICs. Yeah.
Well, I've heard something about floating.
Yeah, that's a little bit more for critiques, which will be during the critique lecture. But the idea there is sort of the same, is that you have a critique that questions the assumptions of the 1AC, and then you can do the plan just without those assumptions tied to it, right? So it still does a majority of the plan, just picks out of something, and then says that something is bad. Yeah.
So that's trying to like work on it. You just like change your whole plan and just like you're saying
Sure.
out all these things.
So an important thing is the more specific, the general rule is the more specific that picks are, the less abusive they are. Because if it really has something to do with the plan, like, let's say for the Cuba Act, you picked out of oil, and you said we don't need to drill for oil, but we can drill for natural gas instead. That does the same. It does most of the plan, like economically engages Cuba, but does it with a different energy source. That seems pretty legitimate because it says oil in the plan text, and you're picking out of that. When it becomes a little less competitive is when you pick out of something that's not in the plan text, right? So, for example, with the Cuba Act, you could read a counterplan to authorize Cuban drilling, U.S.-Cuba drilling together, except in one random part of like the Gulf of Mexico. And you could say like that part of the Gulf of Mexico is a biodiversity hotspot, so we should never drill there, right? But nothing in the plan text really specifies where the drilling is going to occur, what parts of the Gulf of Mexico. So it becomes questionably competitive, but there's still definitely a good strategy there. But like I said, the counterplans that are the most specific are usually the ones that are hardest to answer because it forces the affirmative to defend 100% of their 1AC. Okay, so now we're going to talk about very quickly how, if you're doing your own research, how to find good counterplan evidence. The best evidence and almost the easiest to find is to just go through the 1AC that you're preparing against and go through their solvency evidence, because most of the times the 1AC evidence is sort of researched in a way that's specific to the affirmative, but there are other parts of the article that talk about other policy solutions. So like if you think about the US-Cuban relations advantage, I bet a ton of those like articles that aren't included into the card have other ways to allow for us to increase US-Cuban relations, right? Or to solve for like Florida's environment. Does that make sense? So like there's like a piece, like if I was trying to find a counterplan, I would look at the piece of evidence that says how important it is to preserve Florida's like biodiversity hotspot. And I bet later in that article, there's a solution to solving Florida's biodiversity hotspot that's not US-Cuban drilling. Does that make sense? So there's like good counterplans that you'll find there. And the same goes for pretty much any type of affirmative, not just ones at this camp. The other place that you'll want to look is just like policy think tanks. They oftentimes will have like policy solutions to problems like US-Cuban relations or growing Chinese influence in Latin America, etc. And you can find, if you search on these think tanks, those are where like policy solutions are most likely formulated. And then obviously Google, any way that you would search Google for, how you would find a solution to a problem. And then lastly, sometimes you'll have authors who directly respond to 1AC authors, but that's a little less likely. But that finding good counterplan evidence also just comes with practice and knowing the right think tanks to look for, the right Google searches. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about counterplan competition. And this is really the foundation for what counterplans are theoretically legitimate and theoretically illegitimate to read against affirmatives. So first we're going to talk about some important definitions that we're talking about. So for competition, we mean not like whether or not a counterplan is against another, just a plan. We mean like whether or not the counterplan is actually different from the plan. So a couple definitions that are important to note is the word mutually exclusive. So who thinks they know, like, who can explain what mutually exclusive means?
It's like the counterplan and it's not physically be done. Like,
Together, yeah, exactly. So what's an example of that?
like, for example, like raise something, like raise import taxes or whatever, or raise carrots and lower carrots.
Yeah, exactly. Or like a counterplan that just says don't do the plan. Like you cannot do the plan and not do the plan, right? Those two ideas are mutually exclusive. And in sort of one thing that's like that is engagement and containment. You can't really engage without and contain at the same time. So you might could, but like those are, if you contain, you're not really engaging. But if you're engaging, you're not really containing. So those two ideas are mutually exclusive. The other term is net beneficial, which we talked about. That's just defined as that the counterplan is a better solution or policy option than the affirmative, which typically what you'll see is that there's a disadd to the plan that the counterplan avoids, or there's like an advantage to the counterplan that the plan can't solve. Yeah. And the other definitions are plan minus, and this is sort of what we talked about for the picks, that the counterplan does less action or does less change than the plan is supposed to do, right? So they have to be competitive because the counterplan is doing less than the plan. And we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this a little bit later when it comes to permutations. And then the other way for understanding competition is the word opportunity cost. The definition of that is the value of a foregone option when one action is chosen. It's usually a term used to describe a preference between two options. This is like to show that there's a net benefit. There's an opportunity cost to doing the plan over the counterplan. And that just helps you show a net benefit. So to sort of get an example of what these words mean, I have a few examples. So there's two types of competition. One is competition by being mutually exclusive. So like if the plan was a GDI camper needs to be in the lecture hall by 9 a.m., but the counterplan was a GDI camper wants to sleep in until noon, you cannot physically go to the lecture hall by 9 a.m. and sleep in by noon, right? So those two options are mutually exclusive. Does that make sense? Okay. And so any sort of counterplan in which it's physically impossible to do, the plan and the counterplan at the same time, then they are clearly competitive because they are mutually exclusive. You cannot do the two things at the same time. So you cannot do the plan and ban the plan, right? That's the easiest example. But in terms of there's competition by net benefits or being net beneficial. So a camper needs to be in the lecture hall by 9 a.m. A GDI camper wants to play Robot Unicorn until noon. Or any game. I don't know if you guys know Robot Unicorn Attack. But you can see that there's a net benefit to going to playing Robot Unicorn because you get to play a game instead of going to lecture. But, so it is competitive because it's a different action that's net beneficial. But there's like a problem because what do you think the problem is with those two options? Yeah.
The first thing is that even if you do have an period, you still be distracted technically doing the lecture.
Right. So.
And then also the lecture is more important than anything.
Yeah, that's true. Or if there were really advantages to playing Robot Unicorn, you could just do them in the lecture hall, right? So they're not mutually exclusive, but if you go to the lecture hall, you might not be fully focused on Robot Unicorn, or if you go or you might not be fully focused on the lecture, right? So there's net benefits to those two things, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive because you can combine those two actions. Does that make sense? And so that idea of combination or combining the plan and the counterplan is what brings us to this next theoretical concept, which is the permutation, which is just the idea that the plan and all or parts of the counterplan can be combined to create some sort of like bigger policy or permutation. And this should always be included as one of your answers to a counterplan, because if there's any reason why the counterplan is good, then you should just be able to add it onto the plan. Or if there's any reason why the plan is bad, but the counterplan avoids it, there's a good chance that the combination of the two might also be able to avoid the disadd or the net benefit. So the advantage is, understanding the usefulness of the permutation requires a little bit of debate history. And so to just like basically give you the SparkNote version is that people read a bunch of affirmatives, and the negative read, their sort of strategy was what was called plan-plan debates, where they would say, well, why you say we should do this thing that fits in the topic, well, we think we should do something else, some other part of the topic, right? And basically, like, think about this. If you were negative and some team read their affirmative, and then you just read your affirmative in response to them, you were like, that's a good idea, but we think you should do this totally random thing. Here's like 8 different advantages, all right? And then that causes you to really start to do repetitive argumentation where you don't really basically ever debate each other. But this is really hard for the affirmative because then the negative could just read their whatever advantage they want. And so the affirmative came up with this idea called the permutation, which was just, well, if we can just do the plan, then we can also do the plan and the counterplan, right? So instead of like just where one team says we should do this, the other team says we should do this, the affirmative has an easy out that's like, well, we can just do both of those things. Does that make sense? And so it's a very useful tool. And so, like, for example, if you look in the packet on the China counterplan, there's like a counterplan, and there's an advantage to the counterplan, which is if China acts by itself, then it allows for China to develop soft power and its own influence, right? And so you could just say, well, if China and the U.S. do it together and engage together, then that same benefit of China acting is resolved by the permutation, right? There are obviously negative has to have answers to that, but you can at least resolve some of those net benefits. One of the last things I'll talk about is very quickly permutation theory. What most people think is that permutations have to include all of the plan and parts of the counterplan. So why do you think that permutations have to include all of the plan? What? Okay, they're not sticking to the 1AC. Yeah, any other? Yeah, that not sticking to the 1AC is what's called severance, because ideally the negative has proven that there is something in the 1AC that you're committed to. So like certainty or the USFG. And if the negative has a counterplan and the affirmative is just allowed to change what they've defended in the 1AC, then it becomes hard for the negative to lock down what the 1AC is. So the affirmative is not allowed to sever their initial 1AC, the justifications in the 1AC. Why do you think that a permutation has to include all or parts of the counterplan? What if it doesn't include any part of the counterplan? That's just the 1AC, right? So it's not really a permutation, okay? So like you might hear people sometimes say permutation do the plan. People say that, but don't say permutation do the plan because that's just doing the plan, right? That is the one you see. All right, so why should it include all or parts of the counterplan?
Because it'll, like, if you're gonna do a conversation, you put parts of it together.
So what if it include something? So we've already sort of shown why you can't do just the plan. What if you did something that was not in the counterplan? Yeah.
That justifies it from maybe adding on a bunch of different.
Right. So if the affirmative has a permutation which adds something to the permutation that's not in the counterplan, then nothing prevents the affirmative from just adding anything to the permutation, right? And you can see how that might be hard to prepare to answer. Does that make sense? Yeah, so intrinsic means you just add something, you create a permutation, and you add something to it that's neither in the plan nor the counterplan. Okay? So, like let's say, the one I bet that you might interact with the most on this camp is if someone reads the China counterplan, and you say that the U.S. and China should cooperatively economically engage Cuba over like oil drilling or something, then the negative team might say that you've added the idea that U.S. and China cooperate in Cuba, which is neither in the plan nor the counterplan. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like, this is like sort of, if you think about it this way, so the plan is U.S. Act, and then the counterplan is China Act. That most likely, if you combine these two things, perm, U.S. and China Act, what do you think the negative's response to U.S. and China acting together might be?
That is, that U.S. and China act together is like, wow, that's weird.
That's weird, okay.
Together what we were playing over the counterplan.
Well, yeah, but so if it was just the U.S. and China Act, it doesn't say together. This art is.
Yeah, they could act separately.
Yeah, they could act separately, or like there might be coordination issues, or like yeah.
If they can act together, then why is the United States competing that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's true, but that's not really the negative. What I'm looking for is that the negative might say that, yeah, what's that? Yeah, so the negative, or so the affirmative to win this permutation needs to have evidence that they can work together. If not, if you have so like the negative, or 2 and C, I don't know, these markers kind of are crappy. The 2 and C will just say that the U.S. and China can't work together, right? But if your perm instead was should act together and cooperate, then that's neither in these two things, but gets out of the best answers to the perm, right? So, so it adds something, you can't predict it, and it makes it kind of hard. Okay, so like I said, permutation, I understand I'm running out of time a little bit. The permutation is like a very common app answer. It should always be included in your 2AC, and it needs to include all of the plan and parts of the counterplan. Yeah, that's pretty much what we just talked about, those last 3 bullet points about, and that's why it's severance and intrinsic. Okay. Now we'll talk about common affirmative answers to counterplans. You want to remember the acronym STOP. Okay, so I already sort of given you what they mean. Who wants to take a guess of what solvency means?
A plan that basically comes with another plan, another plan to the affirmative side, if the negative. So
Well,
to solve.
if you're thinking about, you want to look for when I say solvency as an apt answer, what's solvency as an apt answer to a counterplan?
It is basically a plan that basically comes with a solution of some sort that shows that they're wrong.
Well, yeah, you want to show that the counterplan is insufficient to solve the advantages. The counterplans can't solve the advantages, right? So, like we sort of talked about with like certain, when I gave the examples of those counterplans, and I was like, it forces the affirmative to have a, U.S. key advantage, or a whole USFG key advantage, or an engagement good advantage, or a Cuba-specific advantage. That's usually where you're going to find your best solvency deficits, is what it's called, because there is a deficit to the counterplan in which it cannot solve parts of the affirmative. Okay? I think we'll just have to sidestep the theory discussion until later, but sort of when I talked about the competition problems earlier, those are theoretical objections to counterplans. Like if they include the whole plan, then they're theoretically hard for the affirmative to answer. We talked about permutation, and then the last thing to answer counterplans is offense. And what I mean by this is just like you can read disads, like if you're negative, you can read disads to the plan that the counterplan avoids. You can also read disads to counterplans that the affirmative avoids, right? And that means you have an offensive reason why the counterplan is bad, but the plan, like you have a net benefit to the plan, right? So let's say, like, for the different country counterplan that I talked about, if you had a reason why economically engaging Mexico was bad, then you could just read that. If someone read a Mexico counterplan, then you could just read that disad, but it doesn't link to your Cuba act. Does that make sense? And so you could just read other disads, or for like the consult counterplan, like run it by China, there's like a disad that says when we make our foreign policy multilateral, that hurts our leadership because it makes us look weak, right? So there are disads that you might want to read. Yeah, we can just sidestep that. So, are there any questions? I know it's time for lunch, so. If any of you want to look over that last slide and come talk to me, I'll be in lab, so, or we can talk about it sometime later.